Next is reciprocal rights for mothers. There are no information rights for mothers in this bill, except for those women whose children died in certain institutions. Against this is a glaring inconsistency. This bill keeps shifting emphasis and applying different rights and restrictions to different groups. The committee was very clear on this point. We called for a reciprocal right for mothers to receive their full records, including information about their child, and to have input into them in the form of an appendant statement or similar. This was forced family separation surrounded by secrecy. Mothers were coerced and non-consenting participants. Their rights to care, administrative, medical and other records as it relates to them needs to be acknowledged. Next, a public information campaign. The committee recommended that an information campaign should begin at the earliest point possible to avoid delays and should be designed with empathy and sensitivity and in itself be considered a safeguard in protecting privacy rights. There was a strong support for an information campaign around this issue. And while the bill allows for a public information campaign, it gives the Adoption Authority of Ireland considerable latitude in deciding the content and the timing. Witnesses such as the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the Clown Project suggested this as an alternative to the mandatory information session. There is a recommendation for the campaign to be at least 6 months to allow people to consider their options. There's a need for it to be advertised abroad, given the international nature of illegal adoptions in the system, and that it needs to consider non-digital routes, given the age profiles of the individuals involved. It also needs to be available in plain English and consider people with intellectual disabilities. On that point, the first recommendation in the committee report is that plain text should be employed as far as it is possible, both in the bill and in any accompanying documentation, particularly given the sensitive content of the legislation. The bill fails this first criteria. Even for Irish legislation, which is unnecessarily difficult to read, this bill is especially complicated and daunting in numerous sections. This will put additional onus on the information campaign to be as accessible as possible. As well as its technical function, the campaign should be part of a social response to help create a new discourse of truth, accountability and understanding. I think it's really important and worth quoting the Clown Project on this matter. The proposed publicity campaign presents a unique opportunity to let mothers know that they no longer need to bear the burden of secrecy and shame, to let adopted people know that they are equal in the eyes of the law, and to let relatives of the deceased know that they can finally learn what became of their family members. The current section dealing with a public information campaign is insufficient. There should be a greater emphasis on an accessible and wide-ranging campaign aimed at making the process as easy as possible for affected people and their families, as well as helping reframe cultural understandings of this subject, especially in the absence of an official state apology. Finally, counselling. The committee heard unanimous support for extending the bill's provision for counselling to all affected parties. A range of support should be offered to affected persons to include provision of information, counselling and interventions to help address experience of trauma. Section 63, counselling support for parents, again prioritising one group over others. There's a reference in Section 57 to counselling for applicants after they've received records. However, given the limitations on who can apply and for what information, this provision is restrictive. So what about those whose applications were unsuccessful? What about relatives? Several witnesses pointed out the transgenerational trauma that forms part of the legacy of adoptions in Ireland, and there's no recognition of that in the legislation. I've only touched on some of the main points which I'm aware of in my reading of the bill so far and my engagement with individuals and advocacy groups. This gives a sense of the amount of work I think that still needs to be done to make this bill what it should be. Any progress on this matter has to be welcomed. For decades, the state authorities have denied individuals access to information about themselves, their identity and heritage. This has intentionally perpetuated a culture of secrecy and stigma surrounding illegal adoptions, which has furthered the suffering of adopted people, parents and their entire families. In this instance, one arm of the state is attempting to solve the problem created by another. Individuals are entitled to this information under GDPR. However, the government's interpretation of these rights continues to uphold the decades-old secrecy and barriers. If this bill is the answer to that, it is wholly inadequate. It's based on false narratives, treats groups differently, restricts access, attempts to limit GDPR, and fails to provide the reassurances that adopted people, parents and their advocates have sought. I'd urge the Minister to engage with the pre-legislative scrutiny report, incorporating the recommendations in amendments. Be assured that myself and others will be doing so. And the only thing I can hope is that the government would allow sufficient time at that stage to discuss the many amendments that will be coming forward and to not apply the guillotine. In the meantime, I'll be pushing for the Children's Committee to seek a comprehensive response from the Minister on our report, including a rationale for disregarding so many of the recommendations. Like I said, it was from the 7 working days and the disruption of Christmas. It's hard to imagine that maybe all of that work was considered enough. And like I said, we asked survivor groups to come before us time and time again to relive trauma for what it can't be for them to be ignored. The least witnesses and advocacy groups can expect is to be listened to and considered. Over the past few days, all deputies will have received emails and messages from many people asking us to amend the bill. I wholeheartedly support them. The bill needs to be amended substantially to achieve what it claims. These individuals should not have to be asking for amendments. A bill that has gone through several iterations of pre-legislative scrutiny should be much better than the one before us.